conference room was silent except for the hum of the projector. 23 pairs of eyes were locked on the screen as our network infrastructure collapsed in real time. Server after server turned red on the monitoring dashboard. Clayton Beaumont's face had gone from its usual smug pink to a shade of white I'd never seen on a living person. His nephew, the tech lead, who didn't know what GitHub was, sat frozen in his chair, staring at his laptop like it might explode. "We need you to fix this. Now." Clayton's voice cracked as he turned to me. The federal auditors in the corner leaned forward, taking notes. $300 million in contracts hung in the balance, and I was the only person in the room who knew exactly why everything was burning down. Because I'd lit the match myself. Hey everyone, welcome to the Payback Office channel, where we share real stories about workplace revenge, professional karma, and standing up for yourself when the corporate world tries to crush you. If you're new here, you're in for one of the most satisfying tech industry revenge stories I've ever witnessed. Before we dive deep into how I dismantled an entire company's infrastructure to expose nepotism and theft, I want to make a quick ask. We're on a journey to 6,000 subscribers, and every single subscription helps us keep bringing you these stories. If you enjoy watching corporate bullies get what's coming to them, hit that subscribe button. It takes 2 seconds, costs you nothing, and means everything to this channel. Now, let me introduce myself properly. My name is Iris Valdez, and at the time this story takes place, I was a senior systems architect at Crest Technologies, one of the mid-tier government contractors operating out of Arlington, Virginia. I know what you're thinking. Senior systems architect sounds fancy. It was. The title came with a decent salary, a corner workspace with 2 monitors, and the kind of responsibility that aged you 5 years for everyone you spent in the position. But let me tell you where I came from, because it matters. I grew up in a 3-bedroom apartment in Queens with my parents, 2 brothers, and my grandmother. My father worked maintenance at a hospital. My mother cleaned houses during the day and worked retail at night. I learned to code on a refurbished laptop my uncle gave me when I was 12, teaching myself Python while my brothers played basketball outside. I got a full scholarship to Virginia Tech, worked 2 jobs through college, and graduated with a 3.9 GPA and exactly $700 to my name. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you this because it taught me something Clayton Beaumont never learned despite his expensive education and family connections: empathy. I understood what it meant when the overnight security guard looked exhausted. I knew why the janitorial staff appreciated a simple, good morning. I remembered what it felt like to be invisible to people who thought their titles made them superior. That empathy was about to become a weapon. Crest Technologies was a government contractor specializing in cybersecurity infrastructure for federal agencies. Sounds impressive, right? In reality, we were a 70-person company that had lucked into a few good contracts and coasted on them for years. Our biggest client was the Department of Transportation, and we managed a significant portion of their internal network security systems. I'd been hired 3 years earlier as a junior developer and worked my way up fast. Not because anyone was particularly invested in my career, but because I was good. Really good. While other developers were debugging their code for the 3rd time, I was optimizing system architecture and identifying vulnerabilities no one else noticed. The crisis that changed everything started 18 months before the conference room meltdown. It was a Tuesday in March when our entire network infrastructure went down. Not a minor glitch. Not a server hiccup. Complete, catastrophic failure across every client system we managed. The Department of Transportation's internal communications were offline. Data flows stopped. Backup systems failed to trigger. We were looking at potential government investigations, contract terminations, and lawsuits that would bankrupt the company. The development team panicked. Our then tech director, a decent guy named Alan Forrester, called an emergency meeting at 6 in the morning. 12 developers crowded into the conference room, all of us running on adrenaline and coffee. Alan looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. "We need solutions, people. Everything is down. Our existing infrastructure isn't recovering. The client is threatening to pull the contract by end of week if we can't guarantee this won't happen again." The room erupted in suggestions. Migrate to cloud services. Hire an external consulting firm. rebuild the architecture from scratch using off-the-shelf solutions. Every idea had the same problem: time. We didn't have it. The contract specified 99.9% uptime. We'd just blown that commitment spectacularly. I'd been quiet, running calculations in my head. Finally, I spoke up. I can build a custom solution, proprietary infrastructure designed specifically for our clients' needs. It'll be more secure, more stable, and completely tailored to our requirements, but I'll need resources and autonomy. The room went silent. One of the senior developers, a guy named Keith who'd been with the company for 8 years, actually laughed. "You're a junior developer, Valdez. You think you can rebuild our entire network infrastructure alone?" "Yes," I said simply. "Give me 3 months, a budget for hardware, and access to the current system architecture. I'll have a working prototype in 6 weeks and full implementation in 12. Alan studied me for a long moment. He was desperate enough to consider anything, and I'd proven myself reliable on smaller projects. "You'll report directly to me, daily updates. First sign this isn't working, we pull the plug and go with the consulting firm option." Understood? I understood. What followed were the most intense 3 months of my professional life. I essentially moved into the office. My apartment became a place I occasionally stopped to shower and change clothes. I lived on takeout, coffee, and the kind of obsessive focus that only comes when you're building something that matters. Not just to the company, to me personally. This was my chance to prove what I could do. The infrastructure I designed wasn't just functional. It was elegant. I built custom protocols for data transfer that were 23% faster than industry standards. I designed redundancy systems with automatic failover triggers that could handle server loss without interrupting service. I created monitoring tools that could identify potential vulnerabilities and patch them automatically. And here's the critical part: I built it using my personal repository. Let me explain for those who aren't tech people. When developers write code, we typically use version control systems like GitHub to store and manage our work. It keeps everything organized, allows collaboration, and maintains a history of every change. Most developers working on company projects use the company's repository. But because this was my custom design, my proprietary architecture, and my code written outside normal working hours, I used my personal repository. It was accessible to the company servers. I wasn't sabotaging anything. But the core code base lived in my personal account. Alan knew this. We discussed it. He'd agreed that since I was essentially creating intellectual property beyond my normal job scope, I could maintain ownership of the core code while licensing it to Crest Technologies. We had a written agreement. I wasn't being shady. I was protecting my work. The system went live in week 13. It was flawless. Server uptime jumped to 99.97%. Data processing became faster and more secure. The Department of Transportation not only renewed our contract, they expanded it. Suddenly, Crest Technologies was managing twice the infrastructure with half the headaches. The company celebrated. There was a staff meeting where the CEO, a venture capital guy named Ronald Mitchum, praised the team effort that had saved the company. The development team got bonuses. Alan gave a speech about innovation and dedication. I got a plaque and a 5% raise. Don't get me wrong, 5% was nice. But I just saved a 70-person company from bankruptcy and secured millions in expanded contracts. I'd worked 90-hour weeks for 3 months. I'd built something genuinely innovative using skills I'd taught myself. A plaque felt insufficient, but I told myself it was fine. I was still early in my career. Recognition would come. I'd proven my value. This was an investment in my future at the company. That optimism lasted exactly 14 months. Alan Forrester retired. He'd been planning it for years, and the successful infrastructure rebuild gave him the perfect exit. He left on good terms, with a decent retirement package and genuine affection from the staff. His replacement would be critical. This person would oversee all technical operations, manage the development team, and serve as the primary liaison with our government clients. I applied for the position. My qualifications were solid. I had the infrastructure rebuild on my resume. I'd been promoted to senior systems architect 8 months earlier. I had 3 years of institutional knowledge. The development team respected me. I understood the client's needs intimately because I'd built the dam system they were using. The interview process took 6 weeks. I met with Ronald Mitchum, the CEO. I presented to the board. I outlined my vision for the department's future, including proposals for expanding our capabilities and pursuing new contracts. I nailed every single interview. Then they announced Clayton Beaumont as the new technical director. I'd never heard his name before the announcement email. Neither had anyone else on the development team. The company-wide introduction described him as bringing extensive management experience and fresh perspective to our technical operations. What the email didn't mention, but everyone discovered within 48 hours, was that Clayton Beaumont was Ronald Mitchum's nephew. Clayton was 34, expensive haircut, expensive suit, expensive watch. He had an MBA from a decent school and 3 years of technical management experience at a startup that had folded after burning through investor money. His technical knowledge was superficial at best. During his first team meeting, he referred to servers as the computer machines and asked if we'd considered making the website more user-friendly. We didn't have a website. We built back-end infrastructure for government agencies. I gave him the benefit of the doubt initially. Maybe he was uncomfortable. Maybe he'd grow into the role. Maybe his management skills would compensate for his technical gaps. That benefit lasted until his nephew showed up. 2 months after Clayton took over as technical director, he called me into his office. "Iris, I want to talk about the infrastructure you built. It's impressive work." "Thank you," I said, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "I'm bringing in someone to take over as tech lead for that system. His name is Preston Beaumont. He's young but brilliant, fresh perspective, new ideas. I think he'll really take what you've built to the next level." Preston Beaumont. The same last name wasn't a coincidence. "Is he related to you?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "My nephew," Clayton said with zero self-awareness about how this looked. "He just graduated from college. Computer science degree, top of his class. Well, top 20%, but very sharp." A recent college graduate with no professional experience was being brought in as tech lead for the infrastructure I'd designed and built. The infrastructure currently managing a multi-million-dollar government contract. "What will my role be?" I asked. "You'll continue as senior systems architect, of course. But Preston will handle the strategic direction and client communications. You'll support his vision for the platform." Support his vision for my platform that I'd built. I left that meeting and went straight to HR. I filed a formal complaint about nepotism. I documented my qualifications, my work on the infrastructure, and the absurdity of putting an inexperienced recent graduate in a leadership position over a critical government contract. The HR director, a woman named Louise Hartwell who'd been with the company for 15 years, listened sympathetically and did absolutely nothing. "The company has the right to structure the technical team as they see fit," she told me in an email 2 weeks later. "While we appreciate your contributions, personnel decisions are at management's discretion." Preston Beaumont started the following Monday. He was 23 years old, enthusiastic, and catastrophically unqualified. The first day, I gave him a walkthrough of the system architecture. He nodded along, taking notes, asking occasional questions that revealed he didn't understand the basics. He didn't know what GitHub was. He thought repository meant a physical storage location. He asked if the servers were in the cloud or on the ground. These weren't cute beginner questions. These were fundamental gaps that meant he had no business leading anything. But Clayton was determined to manufacture success for his nephew. Over the next 3 months, Preston got credit for every optimization I implemented, every problem I solved, every client meeting I prepared materials for. His name went on reports. He presented my work to stakeholders. Clayton praised his innovative leadership in team meetings while I sat there quietly seething. The development team noticed. Keith, the senior developer who doubted me during the crisis, started making bitter jokes about royal bloodlines. Others were less subtle. Morale tanked. 2 good developers quit within 6 weeks, both citing leadership concerns in their exit interviews. I decided to leave too. I started applying to other companies, confident that my work on the infrastructure would make me extremely marketable. That's when I discovered what Clayton had really been doing. I was updating my portfolio, preparing for interviews, when I decided to check the documentation for the infrastructure system. I wanted current performance metrics, recent optimizations, anything that would make my case studies more impressive. What I found made my blood run cold. Clayton had systematically rewritten every piece of documentation to remove my name. Design documents I'd authored now listed Preston as the lead architect. Technical specifications credited the technical team with no individual recognition. Client reports described Preston's visionary leadership in creating the infrastructure. My 3 months of 90-hour weeks, my custom protocols, my proprietary architecture, all of it was being attributed to a 23-year-old who didn't know what GitHub was. But it got worse. I dug deeper and found that Clayton had been preparing to transfer the entire codebase from my personal repository to a company repository with Preston listed as the primary contributor. He was literally trying to erase me from my own work. The realization hit like ice water. They weren't just taking credit. They were positioning themselves to push me out entirely while maintaining ownership of the infrastructure I'd built. Once the code was transferred to a company repository under Preston's name, my leverage disappeared. I'd be just another senior systems architect with no proof I'd created the system that saved the company. I could have fought this legally. The original agreement with Alan gave me ownership of the core code, but lawsuits take time and money I didn't have. By the time it resolved, the damage would be done. I needed a different approach. That night, I sat in my apartment and thought about everything I'd sacrificed, the relationships I'd neglected, the health problems from stress and overwork. The years of my life poured into a company that was now systematically erasing my contributions to benefit the boss's unqualified nephew. I thought about empathy, the thing Clayton and Ronald and Preston had none of. They didn't see me as a person. I was a resource to be exploited and discarded. So I decided to show them exactly how valuable that resource was. The beauty of having built the entire infrastructure myself was that I knew every vulnerability, every dependency, every critical pathway. I knew exactly where the system was strong and exactly where it could fail. More importantly, I knew that the core codebase still lived in my personal repository. The company's servers accessed it through licensed permissions I'd granted, but the actual code, the DNA of the entire system, was mine. I owned it. I controlled it. Over the next 2 weeks, I prepared meticulously. First, I documented everything. I saved every email showing my authorship of the infrastructure. I archived design documents with original timestamps. I backed up the complete history of my repository showing every commit, every update, every line of code I'd written. I created a paper trail that proved beyond doubt that I, not Preston Beaumont, had built this system. Second, I identified the optimal timing. Crest Technologies had a quarterly review with the Department of Transportation scheduled for the last Thursday of the month. The meeting would include federal auditors, contract compliance officers, and senior government officials. It was the highest stakes meeting of the year, where our performance would be evaluated and contract renewals discussed. Third, I made sure I had witnesses and documentation for my nuclear option. I sent an email to Clayton, copied to HR and Ronald Mitchum, formally requesting credit for my work on the infrastructure. I laid out my contributions in detail. I cited the original agreement with Alan. I asked for appropriate recognition and correction of the documentation. The response came from Clayton 2 days later. It was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak that essentially said my contributions were valued, but that project ownership reflected current leadership structure and no documentation changes were warranted. In other words, we're stealing your work and you can't stop us. Perfect. I needed that in writing. I sent one more email, this time to Ronald Mitchum directly. I outlined the situation clearly and professionally. I explained that I was the sole architect of the infrastructure system. I noted that attributing it to Preston was not only dishonest, but potentially dangerous, given his lack of qualification to maintain critical government systems. I requested a meeting to discuss the situation. Ronald's assistant responded that he was unavailable and I should work with my direct supervisor on technical matters. Also perfect. I'd given them every opportunity to do the right thing. I'd documented their refusal. Now I could act without guilt. The night before the quarterly review, I went into the office at 8 p.m. The cleaning crew was finishing up. I waved to Maria, one of the janitors I always chatted with, and settled into my workspace. Then, I systematically revoked the company's access to my personal repository. The infrastructure didn't crash immediately. The servers were running on the current build, but any attempt to access the source code, make updates, or troubleshoot problems would hit a wall. The foundation of the entire system was suddenly inaccessible. Phase 2 was more aggressive. Buried in the infrastructure code were several custom protocols I'd built. They were designed to fail gracefully if certain conditions weren't met, essentially safety measures to prevent catastrophic problems. But because I'd written them, I knew how to trigger those failures. I created a script that would introduce minor corruptions into the data flow, nothing dangerous. Nothing that would harm actual government data, but enough to cause system alerts and trigger automatic shutdown protocols. I set the script to execute at 10 a.m. the next day, right in the middle of the quarterly review. Then I went home and slept better than I had in months. The quarterly review started at 9:30 a.m. in the main conference room. I arrived at 9:15, dressed professionally, carrying a leather portfolio with printouts of everything I might need. The room was already filling up. Ronald Mitchum was schmoozing with the Department of Transportation's Deputy Director of Technology, a no-nonsense woman named Angela Kim. Federal auditors set up laptops at the far end of the table. Clayton and Preston were huddled near the projector, looking nervous. They should have been nervous. The presentation started smoothly. Clayton gave opening remarks about Crest Technology's commitment to excellence. Preston, reading from slides I'd created 2 months earlier, walked through performance metrics. The infrastructure uptime numbers were impressive. The security ratings were strong. Everything looked great. At 9:58, I excused myself to use the restroom. At 10 a.m., I was in the hallway when I heard the first alarm. Server monitoring systems started pinging alerts. The dashboard displayed on the conference room projector began showing warning indicators. One server cluster flagged a data corruption issue, then another, then 6 more. I walked back into the room just as Preston's face went pale. "What's happening?" Angela Kim asked sharply. I'm not sure," Preston stammered, clicking frantically through screens. "There's some kind of system alert." "Can you resolve it?" one of the auditors asked. "Yes, absolutely," Clayton jumped in. "Preston, pull up the source code and check the data protocols." Preston tried. His laptop spun for a moment, then returned an access denied error. "The repository isn't responding," he said quietly. "What do you mean it's not responding?" Clayton's voice had an edge of panic. "I can't access the source code. It says my permissions are invalid." More servers started failing. The dashboard was turning into a sea of red alerts. The entire infrastructure was entering emergency shutdown mode, exactly as I designed it to do when certain corruption thresholds were exceeded. Angela Kim stood up. "Gentlemen, we need this resolved immediately. We have critical systems running on this infrastructure." Clayton was sweating now, visible dark patches under his arms despite the air conditioning. "Preston, what's your analysis?" Preston looked like he might cry. I need to check the backend protocols, but I can't access the main repository. Maybe we can restore from backup. The backup systems run on the same infrastructure," I said quietly. Everyone turned to look at me. It was the first time I'd spoken during the meeting. "What was that, Miss Valdez?" Angela Kim asked. "The backup and recovery systems are integrated into the main infrastructure. If the core system is failing, the backups won't initialize properly. It's a design feature to prevent corrupted data from being backed up and propagated." "You designed this system, didn't you?" Angela asked, looking at me with sudden attention. Before I could answer, Clayton jumped in. "Miss Valdez was part of the development team, but Preston here was the lead architect." "Preston, shouldn't you know about the backup systems?" Preston was staring at his laptop screen like it held the answers to the universe's mysteries. It didn't. More servers failed. The alerts changed from warnings to critical errors. We were minutes away from complete network failure across all Department of Transportation systems we managed. One of the federal auditors spoke up. "I need to understand the chain of command here. Who is actually responsible for maintaining this infrastructure?" "Preston Beaumont is our tech lead," Clayton said, but his voice had lost all confidence. Then Mr. Beaumont needs to fix this immediately, or we're looking at contract breach conditions. Preston looked at Clayton with naked panic in his eyes. Clayton looked at Ronald. Ronald looked at the federal auditors who were watching his company's infrastructure collapse in real time. Then they all looked at me. Iris, Clayton said, his voice completely different from his usual condescending tone. We need you to fix this, now. I waited a long moment before responding. I'm sorry, but I'm not the tech lead. Preston is. Shouldn't he handle this? He did design the entire system, according to all the documentation. Clayton's face went from white to red. This isn't the time for games, Valdez. The system is crashing. I'm not playing games, I said calmly. I'm following the organizational structure you established. Preston is the lead architect. He should be able to resolve any issues with the infrastructure he built. Miss Valdez, Angela Kim's voice cut through the tension. Am I understanding correctly that you built this infrastructure, not Mr. Beaumont? I met her eyes directly. Yes, ma'am. I designed and built the entire system myself over 3 months, working primarily outside normal business hours. The core codebase is in my personal repository, which I licensed to Crest Technologies. However, recent documentation has been altered to attribute the work to Mr. Beaumont. The conference room went absolutely silent except for the continuing alarm notifications. Ronald finally spoke. Miss Valdez, we can discuss attribution later. Right now, we need you to fix the system before we lose the contract. I opened my leather portfolio and pulled out a printed email. This is the message I sent to Clayton 2 weeks ago, requesting proper credit for my work and correction of the documentation. Here's his response, refusing to acknowledge my authorship of the infrastructure. I placed another document on the table. This is my original agreement with Alan Forrester, establishing that I own the core code base. And this is a complete history of my repository, showing every line of code written, with timestamps proving I developed this system myself. I looked at Clayton. You tried to steal my work and give it to your unqualified nephew. You removed my name from documentation. You positioned Preston to take full credit for infrastructure he couldn't even explain, let alone maintain. One of the auditors leaned forward. Are you saying this entire system is dependent on code you personally own and control? Yes, I confirmed. The company has licensed access to my repository, but I am the owner and sole developer of the core infrastructure. Angela Kim's expression was stone cold. So Crest Technologies built a multi-million-dollar government contract on infrastructure they don't actually own, and they attempted to replace the person who built it with someone who has no idea how it works. The silence was deafening. Clayton found his voice. Now wait a minute, this is all. There's been a misunderstanding about attribution, but the important thing right now, Angela cut him off, is that your company appears to have engaged in fraudulent misrepresentation about your technical capabilities while running critical government systems. Ronald looked like he might have a heart attack. More servers failed. We were approaching total system collapse. Miss Valdez, Angela said, turning to me, can you stabilize the system? Yes. How long would it take? About 15 minutes to stop the cascade failure and restore basic functionality. A few hours to run full diagnostics and ensure everything is secure. She nodded. And what would it take for you to do that? I'd been waiting for this question. I'd prepared for this moment. This was the leverage I needed. First, I want a formal acknowledgement from Crest Technologies, in writing and in front of these witnesses, that I am the sole designer and developer of the infrastructure system currently managing Department of Transportation contracts. Agreed, Ronald said immediately. Second, I want all documentation corrected to accurately reflect my authorship and contributions. Preston Beaumont's name will be removed from any materials where he's falsely credited with my work. Done, Ronald said. Third, I want Clayton Beaumont removed from any oversight of technical operations. He's proven himself dishonest and incompetent. Clayton started to protest, but Ronald shut him down with a look that could melt steel. We can discuss organizational changes, Ronald said carefully. Not discuss. Execute, I corrected. Clayton's removal is non-negotiable. Angela Kim was watching this exchange with what might have been the ghost of a smile. The auditors were taking detailed notes. Fourth, I continued, I want a formal offer for the technical director position, with appropriate salary and equity compensation reflecting the value I've brought to this company. Ronald looked like he was swallowing broken glass, but he nodded. We can make that happen. Finally, I said, I want a new contract regarding the infrastructure codebase. The company can purchase full ownership, but the price is $250,000, paid immediately. The room erupted. Clayton started shouting about extortion. Ronald looked apoplectic. One of the auditors actually laughed. Angela Kim raised her hand for silence. Miss Valdez, those terms seem aggressive. I looked at her steadily. Ma'am, I built a proprietary system that saved this company from bankruptcy and secured millions in government contracts. I did it in 3 months while they paid me a junior developer's salary. They then attempted to steal my work and give credit to an unqualified nepotism hire. Now that system is failing because they tried to cut me out entirely. I gestured at the red-filled monitoring screen. $250,000 is a fraction of what they've made from my work. It's less than they'll lose if this contract terminates, and it's what I deserve. Angela looked at Ronald. Mr. Mitchum, I suggest you accept Miss Valdez's terms. Otherwise, you're looking at contract termination, potential legal action for fraudulent representation, and a company collapse. Her price seems reasonable under the circumstances. Ronald Mitchum, venture capital nepotism enabler, looked at me with pure hatred, but he was trapped and he knew it. Fine, he said through clenched teeth. All your terms. Now fix the damn system. I pulled out my laptop. 14 minutes and 38 seconds. That's how long it took me to stop the cascade failure, restore server functionality, and bring the infrastructure back to stable operation. I worked in complete silence while everyone in the conference room watched. My fingers moved across the keyboard with the confidence of someone who knew every line of code, every protocol, every dependency, because I'd written all of it. The monitoring dashboard slowly shifted from red to yellow to green. Servers came back online in sequence. Data flows resumed. By 10:45 a.m., everything was running normally again. I closed my laptop and looked at Angela Kim. The immediate crisis is resolved. I'll need a few hours for comprehensive diagnostics, but all critical systems are functional. She nodded. Thank you, Miss Valdez. Gentlemen, I think we need to have a separate conversation about contract compliance and technical oversight. The federal auditors stayed. Ronald, Clayton, and Preston were asked to remain. I was dismissed, but not before Angela handed me her business card. I'd like to speak with you later about what happened here, she said quietly. Off the record, I appreciate someone who doesn't tolerate being erased. I took the card and left the conference room. The rest of the day was a blur. HR rushed through paperwork for my new position. The legal team drafted the contract for purchasing my codebase. Ronald's assistant hand-delivered a check for $250,000 by 3 p.m. Clayton Beaumont was placed on administrative leave that afternoon. Preston was terminated the same day, not fired exactly, but his temporary contract position was ended. Ronald tried to spin it as organizational restructuring. The development team heard what happened within hours. Keith stopped by my workspace that evening. I owe you an apology, he said. I doubted you during the first crisis. I watched them steal credit for your work and didn't say anything. You're the most talented developer I've ever worked with, and you deserved better from all of us. Thank you, I said simply. I appreciate that. Over the next week, the full story spread through the company. Some people were supportive. Others thought I'd been too aggressive, too vindictive. I didn't particularly care. I'd been erased and I'd fought back. I'd used the only leverage I had, my skills and my ownership of work they couldn't replicate, to force accountability. The Department of Transportation contract was renewed, but with additional oversight requirements. Angela Kim personally ensured that all technical documentation accurately reflected who built what. The auditors filed a report noting concerns about technical leadership and contractor capabilities that would follow Crest Technologies for years. Clayton Beaumont was quietly let go 6 weeks later. Ronald tried to frame it as a mutual departure, but everyone knew he'd been forced out. Preston went back to wherever nepotism hires go when their uncles can't protect them anymore. I settled into the technical director role and immediately started rebuilding the team's morale and capabilities. 3 months after the conference room meltdown, I was working late when Ronald Mitchum stopped by my office. We'd barely spoken since the incident beyond what was professionally necessary. "Iris, do you have a minute?" I gestured to the chair across from my desk. He sat down, looking uncomfortable. "I wanted to apologize," he said finally. "For Clayton, for the situation with Preston, for how we treated you. It was wrong." I waited, saying nothing. "Clayton is my brother-in-law's son," Ronald continued. "Family pressure to bring him into the company, and then pressure to make opportunities for Preston. I told myself it was fine, that we could train them into the roles. I didn't realize, or didn't want to see, how unqualified they were." "You didn't want to see that you were erasing me in the process," I said quietly. He flinched. "No, you're right. We took advantage of your work, your dedication, and your reluctance to make waves. We assumed you'd just accept it." "Why are you telling me this now?" Ronald sighed. "Because I nearly destroyed this company. The DOT contract includes new provisions that basically put us under a microscope. 2 other clients have asked detailed questions about our technical leadership. We're rebuilding credibility that I damaged by prioritizing nepotism over competence." He looked at me directly. "You saved this company twice. Once when you built the infrastructure, and again when you forced us to acknowledge reality. I wanted you to know that I understand that now. It wasn't the most gracious apology I'd ever received, but it was genuine. I appreciate you saying that," I told him. Ronald stood to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, you're the best technical director we've ever had. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." After he left, I sat in my office thinking about empathy again. I could have burned the company down completely. I could have let the infrastructure fail without offering to fix it. I could have walked away and let them face the consequences alone. But that wasn't who I was. I came from a family that taught me the value of work, of integrity, of standing up for yourself without losing your humanity in the process. Looking back on the conference room confrontation, people sometimes ask if I feel bad about how aggressively I played it. The answer is no. I gave them every opportunity to do the right thing. I requested proper credit through official channels. I documented the theft of my work. I escalated to senior leadership. Every step of the way, they chose nepotism and dishonesty over basic fairness. They forced my hand. I just made sure I was holding better cards than they realized. The tech industry has a massive problem with taking advantage of talented people who don't fit the traditional profile. Women, people of color, people from working-class backgrounds, were expected to work twice as hard for half the credit. We're supposed to be grateful for opportunities, while watching mediocre men get promoted over us because of whose nephew or fraternity brother they are. I refused to accept that, and I had the skills to back up my refusal. That's the real lesson here. Develop skills that make you indispensable. Document your work obsessively. Know your value and don't let anyone convince you to settle for less. And when someone tries to erase you, make sure you control something they can't replicate. I'd done my homework. I'd built something they couldn't replace. I'd chosen my moment perfectly, and I'd documented everything so thoroughly that they couldn't deny the truth. Preparation beats power every single time. So that's my story. The time I watched a director hand my proprietary codebase to his nephew, then had to watch servers crash in real time while federal auditors took notes, and the same director begged me to fix what I'd deliberately broken. Some people call it revenge. I call it accountability. The tech industry is slowly changing. Nepotism is being challenged. Documentation standards are improving. More companies are being held accountable for who actually does the work versus who takes the credit. But we're not there yet. Stories like mine still happen every day in every industry. Talented people get erased. Hard work gets stolen. Mediocrity gets promoted because of connections rather than competence. The difference is whether you fight back. I chose to fight. I used the tools available to me, my skills, my ownership of critical work, my meticulous documentation, and my willingness to create a crisis to force honesty. Would I do it again? Absolutely. Would I recommend it to everyone? That depends. You need to know your value, control something irreplaceable, and be willing to accept the consequences of forcing accountability. But if you have those things, don't let anyone erase you. Don't accept theft of your work. Don't let nepotism and dishonesty define your career trajectory. Stand up, document everything, know your worth, and when the moment comes, be ready to use every bit of leverage you've built. That's how you turn a story of workplace theft into professional revenge. Before I sign off, I want to remind you about subscribing to the Payback Office channel. We're building a community of people who believe in accountability, who celebrate standing up to workplace injustice, and who enjoy watching corporate bullies face consequences for their actions. Hitting that subscribe button supports this channel and helps us reach our goal of 6,000 subscribers. If this story resonated with you, your subscription means we can keep bringing you more stories like this. Thanks for watching. I'm Iris Valdez, and this was the story of how I made an entire company realize that the person they tried to erase was the only one who could save them. Remember, they can't steal what you never fully gave them. Own your work, know your value, and never let anyone convince you that being difficult is worse than being forgot. See you in the next one.